The wind had a bite to it, a dry, scouring thing that carried the taste of dust and distance. Luke Kerrigan felt it on the back of his neck, a familiar warning. He pulled the brim of his hat lower, his eyes scanning the horizon where the sky was turning a bruised, sickly yellow. A dust storm was coming, one of the bad ones that could strip a man of his senses and leave him blind and choking in a world of grit. He urged his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, into a quicker trot. He had just delivered the last of Henderson's cattle to the railhead, a 2-day ride, and the money in his pocket felt like a small, hard knot of security in a life that offered very little of it. He preferred it this way, the long, silent miles with only the creak of his saddle and the steady rhythm of Gideon's hooves for company. The land out here was unforgiving, a vast canvas of rock and sagebrush that cared nothing for the men who tried to tame it. It was honest in its cruelty, which was more than could be said for most people. Luke had learned that lesson the hard way. The memory, sharp and cold as a shard of glass, was always there just beneath the surface. The sight of his brother, William, hanging from the branch of a cottonwood tree, his face a mask of purpled agony, hanged for the crime of offering a meal and a bed to a family of freedmen. The town had called it justice. Luke called it murder. He had been a day too late to stop it, and that day had carved out a space inside him that nothing could ever fill. So he kept to himself, ran his small cattle operation deep in the hills, and asked for nothing from a world he no longer trusted. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, the red rock walls rising on either side like ancient, crumbling monuments. The wind howled through the pass, throwing sand against his face. It was getting harder to see, the air thickening into a brown haze. He should have been looking for an overhang, a place to wait out the storm. But something else caught his eye. Ahead, where the trail widened, lay a dark, splintered shape against the pale earth. It was the wreck of a stagecoach. He slowed Gideon to a walk, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle in his scabbard. Caution was a reflex, a habit burned into him by the war and the years that followed. The stagecoach was a ruin. One side was blackened and charred. The wood splintered into jagged pieces. A broken wheel lay half buried in the sand. There was no sign of the team, no sign of life at all. Robbers, most likely. They would have taken the horses, the strongbox, and anything of value from the passengers. He had heard stories of a gang working the trail south of Prescott. They were known for being brutal, for leaving no witnesses. Luke dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dust. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. He circled the wreck, his gaze sweeping the ground. He saw the tracks of several horses, already being erased by the storm. He saw scattered luggage, torn open and discarded. Then he saw the body. At first, he thought she was dead. She was lying beside a large boulder, almost hidden from view, a crumpled figure in a dark, torn dress. Her face was turned away from him, half buried in the sand. One of her boots was missing, the other still on a slender, stockinged foot. There was no color in her skin. She was as pale as bleached bone. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. He touched his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against his calloused skin, as fragile as a bird's heartbeat. She was bleeding from a wound on her temple, a dark, matted stain in her auburn hair, which had come loose from its pins and spread across the sand like a silken shawl. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, revealing a pale expanse of skin marred by a dark bruise. She was small, fine-boned, with delicate hands that were scraped and raw. She did not belong out here. She was like a porcelain doll dropped in a pigsty, something precious and breakable that had fallen into the wrong world. He looked around again, his jaw tight. The outlaws were long gone, leaving her for dead, or worse. Assuming the storm would finish the job, he could not leave her here. It was not in him, no matter how much he wanted to ride on and forget he had ever seen this, to retreat back to the quiet solitude of his cabin. He could not. His brother's face flashed in his mind. William had always done the right thing, even when it was the hard thing, especially when it was the hard thing. With a soft groan, Luke gently gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and she made a small, pained sound in the back of her throat, but did not wake. He carried her to Gideon, who snorted and shied away from the unfamiliar scent of blood and perfume. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, calming the horse with a steady hand on its neck. Mounting with her dead weight was a clumsy, awkward struggle, but he managed it, settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist and took the reins in his other hand. The storm was almost upon them now, the world dissolving into a swirling vortex of brown. He turned Gideon's head toward the hills, toward the faint promise of shelter, and rode into the heart of the maelstrom. The cabin was a small, solid structure built of pine logs he had cut and notched himself. It stood in a clearing, protected on 3 sides by a thick stand of aspen and pine, with a clear view of the valley below. It was his fortress, his sanctuary. He carried the woman inside, the wind slamming the door shut behind them with a violent crack. The single room was dim, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A narrow bed stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves holding a few books, tins of food, and cooking pots lined another wall. He laid her gently on his bed, the only soft place in the entire cabin. For a moment he stood over her, uncertain. He was a man accustomed to dealing with cattle, horses, and the occasional rattlesnake. He knew how to set a fence post and how to clean a rifle, but he knew next to nothing about caring for a wounded woman. He started with what he knew. He built up the fire, the flames catching quickly and casting a warm, flickering light across the room. Then he filled a basin with water from the barrel just inside the door, wincing at how cold it was. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, dipping a clean cloth into the water, with painstaking gentleness. He began to clean the wound on her temple. It was a nasty gash, swollen and crusted with dried blood, but it did not look deep enough to be fatal. As he worked, he saw the faint, dark circles under her eyes, the lines of exhaustion and fear etched around her mouth even in unconsciousness. She moaned softly, her brow furrowing in pain, and he paused, his hand hovering in the air. "It is all right," he whispered, though he knew she could not hear him. "You are safe now." He cleaned the dirt and blood from her face and hands, his touch as light as he could make it. Her skin was soft, a world away from the sun-beaten, weathered skin of the women he knew. He noticed a faint locket on a delicate chain around her neck, tucked inside the bodice of her dress. He left it alone. Her torn dress was a problem. It was filthy and would need to be cleaned, and he would have to check for other injuries. But the thought of undressing her while she was unconscious felt like a violation, another act of theft against someone who had already lost so much. He decided against it. Instead, he pulled a heavy wool blanket from the foot of the bed and covered her to her chin. He removed her remaining boot and stocking, his fingers fumbling with the laces. Her foot was cold, and he chafed it between his hands before tucking it under the blanket. For 3 days, she did not wake. The dust storm blew itself out, leaving a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. Luke tended to her with a quiet, methodical patience. He kept the fire going, spooned broth and water between her lips when he could, and regularly cleaned her wound. He slept in a chair by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him, waking at the slightest sound. He moved about the cabin with a quietness that was not natural to him, his heavy boots making soft, shuffling sounds on the wooden floor. During the day, he did his chores, his mind constantly returning to the still, silent figure in his bed. He fixed a section of fence that had come down in the storm, his hands working automatically while his thoughts churned. He did not know who she was or where she had come from. but her presence had shattered the careful peace of his solitude. The cabin felt different now, smaller and yet less empty. On the morning of the fourth day, he was sitting at the table, cleaning his pistol, when he heard a sharp intake of breath. He looked up. Her eyes were open. They were the color of moss, a deep, shadowed green, and they were filled with a raw, animal terror. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room, finally landing on him. A wave of panic washed over her face. She shrank back against the headboard, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry, raspy whisper. "Who are you?" Luke set the pistol down on the table, making sure his movements were slow and unthreatening. He stayed in his chair, keeping his distance. "My name is Luke Kerrigan. This is my cabin. You are safe here." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Safe?" The word was a bitter mockery on her lips. She looked down at herself, at the blanket covering her, and a fresh wave of fear crossed her features. "What did you do to me?" The question was like a slap in the face. He felt a flush of anger, but he pushed it down. He had to remember what she must have gone through. "Nothing," he said, his voice low and steady. "I did nothing. I found you by a wrecked stagecoach. 3 days back, you were unconscious. You had a bad head wound. I brought you here to wait out the storm." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You were barely breathing when I found you." She watched him, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. He met her gaze directly, his own expression sober and plain. He had a strong, weathered face, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. His hair was dark, his shoulders broad. He looked like a man who was part of the land, as rugged and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. But there was a quietness in his eyes, a stillness that was not menacing. She seemed to relax, just a fraction, the rigid terror in her posture easing into a wary exhaustion. "The stagecoach, I remember, there were men." Her voice trailed off, her eyes clouding with a memory she clearly did not want to revisit. "They were gone when I got there," Luke said, sparing her the details. "They took the horses." She swallowed hard, her hand coming up to touch the bandage on her temple. He had redressed it that morning while she slept. She seemed to be taking stock of her situation, her mind working behind the wall of fear in her eyes. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a long moment. He could see the conflict in her face, the instinct to hide, to protect herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and deliberate. "Anna," she said. "My name is Anna." He nodded, though he had a feeling it was not her real name. The way she said it, the slight, almost imperceptible pause before she spoke. It felt like a lie. But he did not press her. She had a right to her secrets. He had his own. "Well, Anna," he said, rising from his chair. "You should rest. I will make some coffee." He turned his back to her then, a deliberate act of trust, and moved to the fireplace. He could feel her eyes on him, watching his every move. He busied himself with the coffee pot, giving her space to breathe, to adjust to this strange new reality. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman with a haunted past and frightened eyes. He did not know it then, but the simple act of lifting her from the dust had changed the course of his life forever. In the days that followed, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the small cabin. The woman who called herself Anna remained guarded, her movements tentative, her words few. She spoke only when necessary, answering his questions with a quiet reserve that bordered on mistrust. She never spoke of where she had come from, or where she had been going. Her past was a locked room, and she kept the key hidden deep inside. Luke, for his part, gave her the space she so clearly needed. He did not ask questions. He moved out of his bed, sleeping on a bedroll by the fire, and made it clear that the bed was hers for as long as she needed it. He treated her, not as a guest, but as a fellow survivor. He expected nothing from her. When her strength began to return, she started to help with small chores around the cabin, as if needing to earn her keep. She swept the floor with a quiet efficiency, washed their few dishes, and mended a tear in one of his shirts with the neat, precise stitches that spoke of a different kind of life. A life of parlors and sewing circles, not dirt floors and wilderness. Life in the high country was a constant struggle, a relentless war against the elements. The world outside the cabin was harsh and demanding. Luke showed her the reality of it without words. She saw him break a layer of ice in the water barrel each morning with the back of an axe just to get water for coffee. She heard the howling of wolves at night, a hungry, lonely sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up, and saw the grim set of Luke's jaw as he checked his rifle before stepping outside in the dark. She watched him spend an entire day in the freezing wind, resetting a line of fence posts that had been pushed over by a heavy snowdrift, his hands raw and red by the time he came inside, his face chapped by the cold. There was no room for weakness in this world. Survival was a full-time job. Through the quiet rhythm of their days, she began to observe him. She saw a man of immense patience and quiet decency. One of his horses, a young mare, had gashed her leg on a piece of barbed wire. Maria watched from the doorway of the cabin as Luke spent over an hour gently cleaning the wound, his voice a low, soothing murmur as he calmed the frightened animal. He stitched the wound with a steady hand, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man so large and powerful. She learned that he rode into the nearest town, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings called Redemption, only when absolutely necessary, to buy flour, salt, and coffee. He returned once, his lips split and a dark bruise forming on his cheekbone. He did not speak of it, but she overheard a passing rider a few days later telling a story about how Luke Kerrigan had faced down 3 drunkards who were tormenting an old stable hand. He had not thrown the first punch, the rider said, but he had certainly thrown the last. He seemed to carry a quiet authority that he rarely used, a capacity for violence that he kept tightly leashed. At night, when the chores were done and the cabin was filled with the warm, dancing light of the fire, he would sit in his chair and read. He had a small collection of books on a shelf: Shakespeare, the Bible, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, and a book on animal husbandry. Watching him read, his brow furrowed in concentration. She saw a side of him that contradicted the hard, calloused exterior. He was not just a cattleman, not just a survivor. There was a depth to him, a thoughtfulness that she found both unnerving and compelling. But her own past would not grant her peace. It stalked her in her sleep, invading the quiet sanctuary of the cabin with its ugly, grasping hands. Her nightmares were violent, visceral things. She would cry out in her sleep, tormented screams that tore through the silence of the night. "No!" she would whimper, thrashing in the bed. "Leave me be! Please, do not touch me!" Sometimes she would scream names that meant nothing to Luke but were clearly demons to her. "Robert! Father! Help me!" Luke would lie awake in his bedroll, listening, his fists clenched. He never went to her, never tried to wake her. He sensed that a sudden touch, even one meant to comfort, would only terrify her more. He would simply lie there, a helpless witness to her torment, until the screams subsided into choked sobs and then, finally, silence. The next morning, she would emerge from the bedroom pale and hollow-eyed, with a shame that hung about her like a shroud. She never mentioned the nightmares, and neither did he, but he saw the truth of them in the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, or in the way her whole body would go rigid if their hands accidentally brushed when he passed her a plate. He started to piece together the fragments of her story, the unspoken words that screamed louder than any confession, the torn dress, the bruises, the terror in her eyes, the desperate way she clung to a false name. She was not just running from outlaws on a stagecoach. She was running from something far more brutal, a wound that went much deeper than the gash on her temple. And Luke, a man who had made a religion of minding his own business, found himself standing on the edge of a pain so profound it threatened to pull him in. The passing weeks worked a slow change on the woman who called herself Anna. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill out, and a faint touch of color returned to her skin. Like the first blush of dawn on a winter landscape, her movements, once as skittish as a deer's, became more certain. She still carried a deep well of silence within her, but it was no longer the silence of pure terror. It was a watchful, waiting quiet. Her strength returned in small increments. First, she was able to walk to the creek and back without her breath catching in her lungs. Then, she began to take on more of the household chores, moving with a quiet determination that Luke found himself admiring. There was a resilience in her, a stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. One morning, he found her staring at the south wall of the cabin, where a section of chinking had crumbled away, leaving a gap that let in a knife edge of wind. "This will not do for winter," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was the first time she had offered an opinion on anything beyond the immediate needs of the day. Luke nodded. "I have been meaning to fix it. I have the clay and the grass." A fragile partnership was born in the shared work that followed. He showed her how to mix the clay, sand, and dried grass with water to the right consistency. They worked side by side, their hands covered in the thick, cold mud, pressing it into the gaps between the logs. They did not talk much, but a new kind of communication grew between them, a language of shared glances and synchronized movements. He would hold a piece of wood in place, and she would be there with a handful of chinking, ready to fill the space. There was a rhythm to their work, a simple, satisfying harmony that eased some of the tension that had hung between them. He learned that her hands, though delicate, were surprisingly strong. She learned that his presence, which had once terrified her, could also be a source of steadiness, as solid and dependable as the log walls they were mending. This fragile camaraderie extended to other tasks. She helped him smoke strips of venison, turning them on the racks with a focused patience. She learned to load his rifle, her movements precise and careful as she followed his instructions, her face a mask of concentration. In these shared moments of labor, the cabin began to feel less like his shelter and her sick room, and more like a shared space, a small bastion against the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. But the peace was a thin layer of ice over a dark, deep lake. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western peaks, Luke was inside, sharpening a knife, when he heard a strange, choked sound from the wood pile. He looked up from his work and went to the door. Anna was standing by the chopping block, an axe held loosely in her hands. She had been trying to split kindling, a task she had taken upon herself. Her shoulders were shaking, and a series of ragged sobs tore from her throat. She raised the axe, not to strike the wood, but in a gesture of pure, helpless rage, her knuckles white. Then, with a cry of anguish that seemed to come from the very core of her being, she let it fall. The axe clattered to the ground. She collapsed with it, sinking to her knees in the dirt, her face buried in her hands as a storm of weeping overtook her. Luke was at her side in 3 long strides. He knelt in front of her, his own heart aching at the raw, unfiltered agony in her cries. He did not speak, did not ask what was wrong. He simply reached out and gently took her arm. She flinched violently at his touch, a reflexive, terrified recoil that was like a knife in his gut. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "Anna," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he could not name. He waited a moment, then tried again, moving more slowly this time. He put his hands on her shoulders, his touch firm but gentle. She was trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Come inside," he said softly. "It is getting cold." She did not resist as he helped her to her feet and guided her back into the cabin. She was pliant, her body racked with shudders, her face hidden from him. He led her to the chair by the fire and gently pushed her down into it. He took the heavy wool blanket from his bedroll and wrapped it around her shoulders. tucking it in around her as if she were a child. Then he stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He sat on the hearth, a few feet away from her, and waited. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the sound of her ragged, painful sobs, which slowly began to subside into shuddering breaths. He did not speak, did not pry. He simply offered his silent presence, a solid, unmoving anchor in her sea of grief. An hour passed. The sky outside turned a deep, star-pricked indigo. Finally, she spoke, her voice a raw, broken whisper, barely audible above the fire.
"He used to say I was too fragile,"
she began, staring into the flames.
"Too delicate for a man of his appetites."
Luke remained silent, his gaze fixed on her profile, illuminated by the firelight. He knew, with a cold certainty, that the locked door to her past was about to open.
"I was engaged to be married,"
she continued, her voice gaining a thin, brittle strength.
"Back in Virginia. His name was Robert. His family was important. My father was so proud."
She gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor.
"Robert was charming. Everyone thought so. He brought me flowers and wrote me poetry. But when we were alone, he was different. He liked to see me cry. He enjoyed my fear."
She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her knuckles white.
"He had a temper. The first time he struck me, he wept afterwards. He swore it would never happen again. He said he loved me too much, that his passion overwhelmed him. I believed him." Her voice cracked. "I believed him every time. When I finally found the courage to tell my father, to beg him to break the engagement, he did not believe me. He said I was being hysterical. He said a man like Robert would never. He said I was lucky. I had nowhere to turn, so I tried to run away. Robert's man caught me at the train station."
She took a deep, shuddering breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, which was somehow more terrifying than her tears.
"He did not strike me then. He was calm. He told me that I was unwell, that my mind was feverish. He had doctors come to the house. They were his friends. They spoke to me in hushed, pitying tones and wrote things in their notebooks. A week later, they took me away. They committed me to an asylum."
Luke felt a cold knot of fury tighten in his stomach.
He had seen the horrors of asylums during the war,
the places where they kept the men whose minds had been shattered by what they had seen and done. They were prisons for the soul.
"It was a place for inconvenient women," she whispered.
"Wives who disobeyed, daughters who shamed their families. We were put away, forgotten."
She looked at him then,
her moss-green eyes wide and filled with a haunted, ancient pain.
"They took my name. They cut my hair. There was no escape."
The war had been her salvation, a terrible, bloody chaos that had upended the world. In the confusion, with the Union Army approaching, the asylum had been partially abandoned. A kindly orderly, a boy who had lost his own sister, had unlocked her door and told her to run. And she had. She had traveled for months, working as a laundress, a seamstress, a scullery maid, always moving west, always looking over her shoulder. She had saved enough money for a stagecoach ticket to California, a place she hoped would be far enough away, a place where she could finally disappear.
"Then the outlaws came,"
she finished, her voice trailing off.
"And I woke up here."
The cabin was silent again, the fire popping and hissing in the hearth. Luke's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to find this Robert, this man with a powerful family and a cruel heart, and show him what real violence looked like. But the man was a ghost, 1,000 miles away. The only thing real was the broken woman sitting in front of him. He cleared his throat, his own voice sounding rough to his ears.
"My brother, William,"
he began, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He had not spoken of William to anyone in years. He was hanged, in redemption. Her head came up.
her own grief momentarily forgotten as she focused on him. "It was after the war," Luke said, his eyes on the fire but seeing a different scene, a cottonwood tree by a dusty road. "He was a good man, too good for this world. Maybe he gave shelter to a family of freedmen who were passing through, just a meal and a place to sleep in the barn for the night. Someone saw, a group of men from town. They decided William was a traitor. They formed a posse. They dragged him from his house." He fell silent, the memory choking him. "I was away, on a cattle drive. I heard about the trouble and I rode back as fast as I could. I rode for 2 days straight. But I was too late." The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy stone in his chest. "I should have been there. I could have stopped them." "You cannot know that," she whispered, her voice filled with a surprising empathy. "He was my brother," Luke said, the words raw and final. They sat in silence for a long time, two solitary souls bound together by the ghosts of their pasts. The air between them had changed. It was no longer filled with suspicion and uncertainty, but with a shared weight of grief, of injustice, of profound and life-altering loss. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes clear and searching. "You are not like the others," she whispered. "Not like any man I have ever known." He met her gaze, his own eyes dark with the memories he had just unearthed. A flicker of something passed between them, a spark of understanding that went deeper than words. "I am no better," he replied, his voice low and honest. "I have just seen too much to be cruel." The world outside the cabin, however, was not so inclined to kindness. A few weeks later, a rider from a neighboring ranch, a man named Jedediah, stopped by on the pretext of looking for a stray calf. He saw Anna hanging laundry on a line Luke had strung between 2 trees. The man's eyes widened, and he tipped his hat with a leering sort of politeness before riding off in a hurry. Luke knew then that his solitude was over. The gossip spread through the high country like a grass fire. It reached redemption before Luke did on his next trip for supplies. He felt it the moment he walked into the general store. The usual hum of conversation died down. Men turned to look at him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The store owner, a man Luke had known for years, served him without meeting his eye, his movements stiff and formal. The rumors were ugly and predictable. Luke Kerrigan, the quiet man in the hills, was harboring a fallen woman, a harlot from the east. Some said, an outlaw's woman, said others. The story changed with each telling, but the core of it remained the same. There was a woman of ill repute in his cabin, and he was a sinner for keeping her there. At first, Luke ignored it. He was used to being an outsider. He did not care for the opinions of the men who had stood by and watched his brother die. But then the whispers turned into actions. When he tried to sell a few head of cattle to Silas Croft, a rancher he had done business with for years, Croft refused him outright. "I cannot be seen trading with a man of your character." "Luke," Croft said, his face flushed with self-righteousness. "It would be bad for my family's reputation." The final straw came a week later. He woke just before dawn to the sound of his cattle, a low, distressed bellowing. He grabbed his rifle and went outside. In the pale morning light, he saw that a long section of his northern fence line had been cut. The wire was snipped in a dozen places, the posts knocked over. His cattle were wandering out onto the open range, scattered and vulnerable to wolves or rustlers. It would take him days to round them all up again. It was a deliberate, malicious act, a clear message. He returned to the cabin, his face a grim, stony mask. Anna was standing by the table, a cup of coffee in her hands. She saw the look on his face and her own went pale. "What is it?" she asked. "Someone cut the fence," he said, his voice flat. Her face crumpled. She put the cup down, her hand trembling. "It is my fault," she whispered. "This is because of me, the man who saw me, Jedediah." "This is not your fault," Luke said, his voice hard. "It is theirs. I have to leave, she said, her eyes filling with tears. I cannot bring this trouble on you. I have brought nothing but trouble to everyone I have ever known. I will go. I will disappear. It is what I am good at. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a wall, an immovable object. No, he said, his voice low but unyielding. You are not going anywhere. But they will ruin you, she cried. They will drive you out. Let them try, he said, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. He had run once, in a way. He had retreated from the world after William's death, hiding in his grief. He would not run again. You are here now, he said, looking directly into her eyes. That means something. That night, a heavy silence filled the cabin. The unspoken fears and the very real threats from outside pressed in on them. They ate their dinner without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. After, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, intimate glow that seemed to hold the cold, hostile world at bay. Anna stared into the fire, her face a study in turmoil. She had spent her life running, hiding, trying to be invisible. But this man, this quiet, solitary man, refused to let her run. He was standing up for her, a thing no one, not even her own father, had ever done. He was facing down the judgment of his neighbors, risking his livelihood, his safety, all for a stranger he had found half dead in the dirt. Slowly, she turned to look at him. He was watching the flames, his profile strong and shadowed, his jaw set in a stubborn line. A wave of emotion washed over her, so powerful it took her breath away. It was a complex mixture of gratitude, fear, and something else, something new and terrifying and hopeful, all at once. Before she could think, before she could lose her nerve, she leaned across the small space between them and pressed her lips to his. His mouth was firm, tasting faintly of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, he was still surprised. Then he responded, his lips softening against hers. The kiss was brief, hesitant, yet charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared pain and fragile hope that had grown between them in the small cabin. He was the one who pulled back. He broke the kiss gently, his hands coming up to rest on her shoulders, holding her at a slight distance. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the vulnerability there, the fear that she had gone too far, that she had made a terrible mistake. She trembled under his gaze, her entire body shaking. She thought he was rejecting her, that she had misread everything, that she had once again offered something that was not wanted. The shame and the fear were a bitter taste in her mouth. "Make me forget every man before you," she whispered, the words a raw, desperate plea, a prayer offered up to the firelight and to the quiet man who held her fate in his hands. Her words hung in the warm, fire-lit air, a plea so raw and vulnerable it seemed to strip away the last of her defenses. "Make me forget every man before you." It was the whisper of a soul pushed to the edge, a prayer for oblivion from a woman who had known nothing but pain from the hands of men. Luke felt the tremor that ran through her body, the fine, violent shudder of someone bracing for a familiar blow. He did not kiss her again. He did not tighten his grip or pull her closer. Instead, his hands, which had been holding her shoulders, moved to her back, and he drew her into an embrace that was solid, steady, and utterly devoid of demand. He held her as one might hold a frightened child or a wounded animal, offering nothing but warmth and the silent, unyielding promise of safety. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke and the clean, cold scent of the night air. "I will do that," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, so quiet she felt the words more than she heard them. He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the truth of his next words settle between them. "But not by taking what has already been taken from you." He felt the tension in her go slack, a slow, boneless release as the fear that had held her rigid finally receded.
A soft, choked sound escaped her lips. Half sob, half sigh. She did not pull away. Instead, she sagged against him, her forehead coming to rest on his chest, her hands clutching weakly at his shirt. He said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. He simply held her, his large frame a shield against the ghosts that haunted her and the hostile world that waited just outside the cabin door. The fire crackled and spat, the logs settling into a bed of glowing embers. And there, in the quiet heart of the wilderness, wrapped in a blanket and held by a man who asked for nothing, she finally fell asleep. He followed soon after, his head resting against the back of the chair, his arms still loosely around the woman who had brought a storm into his quiet life. The next morning broke cold and clear, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. The fragile peace of the night was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Luke was instantly awake, his hand reaching for the rifle he always kept close. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. 4 riders were coming up the trail. He recognized them: Silas Croft, Jedediah, and 2 other ranchers from the valley, Jebediah Stone and his son. Stone was a hard man with a pinched, cruel mouth and a reputation for judging others harshly. Anna was awake, her eyes wide with fear as she sat up in the bed. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Trouble," Luke said, his voice grim. "Stay inside and stay away from the window." He pulled on his boots, shrugged on his coat, and stepped outside, pulling the door shut firmly behind him. He did not take the rifle, a deliberate choice. He would meet them as a neighbor, not as a soldier. He stood on the small porch, his arms crossed over his chest, and waited. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their mounts kicking up dust and snorting in the cold air. Jebediah Stone was their clear leader. He leaned forward in his saddle, his face a mask of grim authority. "Kerrigan," Stone said, his voice flat and hard. "We have come to talk." "Looks more like you have come to stare," Luke replied, his own voice dangerously quiet. "We will not mince words," Stone continued, ignoring the jibe. "The good people in this valley have a certain way of life. We are God-fearing folk who value decency and reputation. You are putting that at risk." "How is that, Jebediah?" Luke asked, his gaze level. "By harboring that woman," Stone said, jerking his chin toward the cabin. "We all know what she is, a woman of low character, run out of some city in the east. You bring her here, to our community, and you shame us all." "She is a guest in my home," Luke said, his voice dropping lower. "She was in trouble. I helped her. That is the end of it." "It is the beginning of it," Silas Croft interjected, his face flushed. "My wife says she will not come to town if there is a chance of running into your whore." The word, ugly and sharp, cut through the cold air. Luke felt a surge of white-hot fury, a familiar, dangerous rage he had not felt since the day he had cut his brother's body down from the tree. He took a single, deliberate step off the porch. His body moved with a fluid, deadly grace. Before Croft even had time to react, Luke's fist shot out, a hard, compact knot of bone and sinew. It connected with Croft's jaw with a sickening crack. Croft cried out and toppled backward off his horse, landing in a heap in the dust. The other men shouted, their hands moving toward the pistols on their hips. "Go ahead," Luke said, his voice a low growl. He did not look at the other men. His eyes were still fixed on Croft, who was groaning on the ground. "Draw on an unarmed man. It seems to be a habit in these parts." Stone's hand froze, hovering over the butt of his gun. He looked at Luke's face, at the cold, murderous promise in his eyes, and he hesitated. He was a bully, not a killer. "This is not over, Kerrigan," Stone snarled, pulling his horse back. "You have made your choice. You have chosen a harlot over your neighbors. Do not come looking for help when the winter bites. Do not expect to trade. You are on your own." He wheeled his horse around, and the others followed, leaving Silas Croft to scramble to his feet, clutching his jaw, and hurry after them. Luke stood and watched them go, his chest heaving, his knuckles scraped and bleeding. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had chosen his side. He was truly alone now, with only the silent woman in the cabin to stand with him against the coming storm. The storm came 2 weeks later, not as a posse of angry men, but as a deluge from the heavens. A warm wind had blown in from the south, melting the early snow on the peaks. Then the rain started, a cold, relentless downpour that lasted for 3 days. The creek that ran through the edge of Luke's property, normally a placid, meandering stream, swelled into a churning, muddy torrent. On the third night, Luke was woken by a roar that sounded like a freight train. He knew the sound instantly. The creek had broken its banks. He threw on his clothes and ran outside, a lantern in his hand. A wall of brown water was sweeping across the lower pasture where his small herd of cattle had been sheltering. "Anna!" he yelled, running back to the cabin. "The creek is flooding. I have to get the cattle to higher ground." She was already dressed, her face pale in the lantern light. "I will help," she said, her voice firm. "Stay here," he ordered. "It is too dangerous." "You will need another pair of hands," she insisted, pulling on the sturdy boots he had bought for her in town. "I am not made of glass." "Luke." There was no time to argue. He nodded grimly, and they ran out into the maelstrom. The rain was a solid sheet, plastering their hair to their heads and soaking them to the bone in seconds. The water was already knee-deep in the pasture, cold and fast-moving. The cattle were panicked, lowing in terror as they struggled against the current. For the next 2 hours, they fought the flood. It was brutal, exhausting work. They waded through the treacherous, debris-filled water, shouting and pushing, forcing the terrified animals toward the safety of the wooded hillside. A young calf was swept away by the current, its frightened cries swallowed by the roar of the water. Luke lunged after it, managing to grab it by the neck and haul it back, his muscles straining with the effort. Anna was a revelation. She was fearless, her small frame surprisingly strong as she shoved a stubborn heifer, her voice a high, clear cry above the storm. She never complained, never hesitated. They were a team, moving and working together in the chaos, a small island of shared purpose in a world gone mad. Finally, the last of the animals was safe on high ground. They stood in the pouring rain, covered in mud, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. The adrenaline that had been coursing through them began to fade, leaving behind a profound, aching weariness. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair hanging in wet ropes around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her green eyes shining in the lantern light, and a single tear traced a clean path through the mud on her cheek. And then the dam inside her broke. The terror of the flood, combined with the weeks of fear and uncertainty, overwhelmed her. A ragged sob escaped her lips. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. She clung to him, her face buried in his wet, cold coat, and wept. She cried for the life she had lost, for the cruelty she had endured, and for the fear that it would never end. He held her tightly, his own emotions a chaotic storm inside him. He felt a fierce, protective surge, a desperate need to keep this woman safe, to shelter her from all the ugliness of the world. He lowered his head and found her lips with his. The kiss was nothing like the first one. It was raw, desperate, and hungry. It was a kiss of survival, of two people who had faced down the darkness and found each other on the other side. It was a kiss filled with the rain, the mud, the chaos, and the unspoken, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, they were not alone after all. It was a moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability, a passionate, tear-filled surrender in the heart of the storm. In the days that followed, the memory of that night lay between them, a powerful, unspoken thing. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. They worked to clean up the damage, but the emotional landscape had been permanently altered. The walls between them had been washed away. Her past, however, continued to cast a long shadow. The shared crisis had unearthed painful memories. One afternoon, while mending a saddle blanket, the image of her father's face rose in her mind, as clear and cold as if he were standing in the room. She remembered the day she had gone to him, her cheek still stinging from Robert's hand, and begged for his help. He had listened to her with a cool, detached impatience, his study smelling of old leather and disappointment. "Maria," he had said, his voice clipped and final, "you will marry Robert. You will not bring this scandal upon our family. You are being dramatic. Control yourself." He had not offered comfort. He had not offered protection. He had offered only judgment. He had chosen his reputation over his daughter. The memory was so sharp, so painful, that she drove the needle deep into her finger, a small, sharp shock to bring her back to the present. She began to write again, a habit from her former life that she had abandoned in her flight. Luke found an old, half-used ledger and sharpened a pencil for him. She would sit by the fire at night, not speaking, her head bent in concentration, filling the pages with her small, elegant script. She wrote letters she would never send, one to her father, filled with all the rage and pain she had never been allowed to express, one to Robert, a cold, precise catalogue of his cruelties. And she started a letter to Luke, one she kept tucked away in the back of the ledger. She did not know what to say to him, how to explain the tangled knot of gratitude and fear and burgeoning affection she felt. So she simply wrote about her days, about the way the light fell across the valley in the morning, about the surprising strength in her own hands, about the quiet decency of the man who had saved her. Luke, meanwhile, was engaged in a secret project of his own. About a mile up the canyon from his cabin stood the ruin of an old line shack, abandoned years ago. The roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung from a single leather hinge. Without telling her, he began to repair it. He spent his afternoons there, replacing the rotten logs, patching the roof with new shingles he had cut himself, and building a new, sturdy door. He even built a small, simple bed frame and a table. It was hard, solitary work, but he did it with a quiet determination. He was not trying to get rid of her. In fact, the thought of her leaving now left a cold, empty feeling in his chest. He was doing it for her. He was giving her a choice, a space that was entirely her own. If she wanted to stay, but not with him, she could. If she needed a place to be alone, a place to heal without his shadow falling over her, she would have it. It was his way of honoring her plea. He could not erase her past, but he could give her a future where she was in control. One Sunday, he hitched his horse to the small buckboard wagon he owned. "I am going to town," he said to her. "Do you want to come?" She hesitated. She had not left the property since the day he brought her here. "Is it safe?" she asked. "It is Sunday," he said. "Most people will be at church. We will not stay long." She agreed, her face a mixture of apprehension and a faint, flickering curiosity. The ride to redemption was quiet. The town was sleepy, a few horses tied to hitching posts, a dog sleeping in the dusty street. He took her not to the main part of town, but to a small, whitewashed chapel that stood on a hill at the edge of the settlement. It was plain and unadorned, a humble place of worship for a humble community. They went inside. The chapel was empty, cool and silent, smelling of old wood and beeswax. Sunlight streamed through the simple glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Without a word, Maria walked to a small stand where a few candles flickered. She took a taper, lit a new candle, and placed it in the stand. She stood before the small flame, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. She was not praying, not in any formal sense. She was simply remembering the dead, the lost, the person she used to be. Luke did not know what to do. He was not a church-going man, but he walked up behind her and, in a gesture of pure, simple solidarity, he knelt on the hard wooden floor beside her. He did not pray. He just knelt, sharing her silence, bearing witness to her private grief. It was an act of profound intimacy, a quiet joining of two wounded souls in a holy place. That night, the air in the cabin was different. The last of the barriers had fallen. After their simple dinner, as they sat by the fire, she turned to him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, steady resolve. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "Luke," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My name is not Anna. It is Maria." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. "I know," he said softly. She rose, pulling him gently to his feet. She led him to the bed, the one that had been hers alone for all these weeks. She initiated their first night together. It was nothing like the desperate, frantic kiss in the rain. It was tender, slow, and filled with a deep, unspoken trust. Every touch was a question, every response an answer. He was patient, gentle, his body a source of warmth and comfort, not a weapon of fear. For the first time in her life, she felt cherished. She felt safe. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the warm blankets, the firelight painting flickering patterns on the ceiling, she turned to him, her voice a soft murmur in the darkness. "I did not believe love could be this gentle," she confessed, the words a quiet revelation. He kissed her forehead, his heart full of an emotion so powerful it almost frightened him. He had found something here, in this remote cabin, something he had thought he would never have again. A reason, a home. Their newfound peace was shattered 3 days later. A man rode up to the cabin. He was not a rancher. He was dressed in a fine, dark suit, now covered in dust, and he rode an expensive horse. He looked completely out of place in the rugged landscape. He was clean-shaven, with cold, intelligent eyes, and a smile that did not reach them. Luke met him on the porch, his body instinctively shielding the doorway. Maria watched from the window, her blood turning to ice. She did not know the man, but she knew his kind. "I am looking for a man named Luke Kerrigan," the stranger said, his voice smooth and educated. "You have found him," Luke replied. The man's smile widened slightly. "Good. My name is Mr. Evans. I am a private agent, hired by a prominent family in the East. I am looking for a woman, a runaway. Her name is Maria Delaney. I've been informed she was seen in this area." His eyes flicked to the cabin, a knowing look on his face. "There is a substantial bounty for her return, and questions to be answered. She is unwell, an escapee from a private institution." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Cooperation would be wise, for everyone involved." Luke's voice was a low, flat thing, colder than the wind that whipped down from the peaks. "There is no woman by that name here," he said, his body a solid, unmoving wall in the doorway. He took a single, slow step forward, off the porch and onto the dirt, closing the distance between them. The move was subtle, but the message was clear. He was no longer defending his home. He was claiming the ground beneath his feet. Mr. Evans's polished smile faltered for the first time. He was a man accustomed to wielding power through words and the threat of the law, not the raw, physical presence of a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself. "There is no need for unpleasantness, Mr. Kerrigan," Evans said, his hand making a slight, nervous gesture. "As I said, she is unwell. My client is simply concerned for her welfare." "Is that what he calls it?" Luke's voice was laced with a quiet contempt that was more menacing than any shout. "Concern?" He took another step, so close now that Evans's horse shifted nervously. "You have come a long way. It would be a shame for you to have an accident on the ride back. The trails are treacherous." The threat was plain, delivered with the calm finality of a death sentence. Evans swallowed, his composure finally cracking. He was a creature of the city, a wolf in the drawing room, but out here, in the vast, silent wilderness, he was prey. He looked at Luke's eyes, as hard and gray as granite, and saw no room for negotiation. He saw a man who had been pushed to a limit and would not be pushed any further. "I see," Evans said, his voice strained. He gathered his reins, his movements suddenly jerky. "I will deliver your message." "You do that," Luke said. "And you can add a message from me. This is my land. The next time you set foot on it, I will consider it trespassing, and I deal with trespassers myself." Without another word, Evans wheeled his expensive horse around and spurred it into a hasty retreat down the trail. Not looking back, Luke stood and watched until he was out of sight, a lone, grim figure against the vast landscape. Only then did he turn and go back inside the cabin, the cold fury still radiating from him like a winter chill. Maria was standing in the middle of the room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her face was ashen. "He knows my name," she whispered, the words filled with a renewed terror. "They will not stop. They will never stop." Luke went to her, his expression softening as he looked at her frightened face. "We can leave," he said, his voice gentle now. "Tonight, we can pack what we need and ride north. They will not find us. I will keep you safe." He was offering her the one thing she had always sought, a way to run, to disappear. But as she looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, at the man who had just faced down her past without flinching, something inside her shifted. A small, hard kernel of defiance that had been buried under years of fear began to grow. She had been running her whole life, from her father's judgment, from Robert's cruelty, from the horrors of the asylum, from the outlaws on the trail. Running had kept her alive, but it had not allowed her to live. She straightened her shoulders, a subtle but profound change in her posture. She lifted her chin. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I have spent too long hiding." She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and intense. "I am done with fear." Her decision hung in the air, a declaration of war against the forces that had hounded her. Luke saw the new strength in her, and his heart swelled with a fierce, protective pride. He nodded slowly. "All right, Maria," he said, speaking her real name like a vow. "We do this your way. We stand." But standing their ground proved to be a battle fought not with guns, but with whispers and sideways glances. The town of redemption, which had already judged them, now doubled its efforts to cast them out. The following Sunday, a new preacher, a traveling fire and brimstone sermonizer named Reverend Miller, took the pulpit at the small chapel on the hill. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that burned with zealous fire. His sermon was a masterpiece of veiled condemnation. He spoke of the serpent in Eden, of the wickedness that can fester in the lonely places of the world. He thundered against the sins of the flesh, his voice rising with righteous fury. "And I say unto you," he boomed, his gaze sweeping over the congregation, "beware the fallen woman, for her path is the path to ruin. Beware the man who shields her, for he invites the devil into his home and into our community. He brings a scarlet stain upon us all." Maria had insisted on going to town for supplies, a small act of defiance. She was standing at the back of the mercantile, her basket in hand, when the Reverend's voice, carried on the clear morning air, reached her through the open door. Every word was a physical blow. She could feel the eyes of the other women in the store on her, their faces a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. The shame was a crushing weight, a suffocating cloak that stole the air from her lungs. She dropped her basket, the tins and packages clattering to the floor, and fled. Luke found her in the wagon, huddled on the seat, her body racked with silent, agonizing sobs. He said nothing, simply turned the wagon around and drove them home, the sound of her weeping the only sound on the long, quiet ride back to the cabin. But Luke could not let it stand. The next day, he rode into redemption alone. He found Reverend Miller holding court on the steps of the general store, surrounded by a small group of admiring townsmen, including Jebediah Stone. Luke dismounted and walked toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. The conversation faltered as he approached. Miller turned, a look of pious challenge on his face. "Mr. Kerrigan," he said, "have you come to confess your sins?" "No, Reverend," Luke said, his voice dangerously calm. "I have come to talk about yours." He stopped directly in front of Miller, forcing the taller man to look down at him. "You used your pulpit yesterday to attack a defenseless woman, a woman you have never met, whose story you do not know." "I spoke of sin," Miller said, puffing out his chest. "It is my duty to root out wickedness." "It is your duty to practice Christian charity," Luke countered, his voice rising slightly, clear and sharp enough for everyone in the street to hear. "But you would rather stand in judgment. You talk of shame, but you know nothing of it. Let me tell you what real courage is. Reverend, it is not shouting from a pulpit. It is surviving. It is facing down cruelty and terror and finding a reason to keep breathing. The woman you condemned is a survivor, and you are a coward who uses God's word as a weapon to hurt those who are already wounded." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. No one had ever spoken to a man of the cloth that way. Miller's face turned a mottled red. "This is blasphemy," he sputtered. "No," Luke said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "This is the truth, and you should be careful who you call a sinner in a town full of men who stood by and let my brother be murdered." He turned his back on the stunned preacher and walked away, leaving a shocked and ringing silence in his wake. The confrontation had consequences. Later that week, Sheriff Brody rode out to the cabin. He had been a friend of William's, and he and Luke had always shared a quiet, respectful understanding. Brody was a fair man, but he was also a practical one. "Luke," he said, dismounting and accepting the cup of coffee Luke offered him, "you are making this hard on yourself. And on me." "What is that supposed to mean, Samuel?" Luke asked. "Challenging the preacher in the middle of the street? Picking fights with Silas Croft? You are making powerful enemies. Stone has half the valley in his pocket. People are scared. They do not like what they do not understand." "And what is it they do not understand?" Luke asked, his eyes hard. "That a man should help someone in need. That a woman has a right to be safe. They understand that there is a woman living in your cabin that you are not married to," Brody said bluntly. "They understand that a man from the east with a lot of money is looking for her. It looks bad. Luke, it looks like trouble, and I am the one who has to clean up trouble." He sighed, looking at his old friend with weary eyes. "Just be careful, for your own sake." "I appreciate the warning." "Samuel," Luke said quietly, "I have made peace with being alone, but she will not be—" The sheriff nodded, his face grim. He knew it was useless to argue. He drained his coffee cup, mounted his horse, and rode away, the dust of his departure leaving Luke and Maria even more isolated than before. But they were not entirely alone. A few days later, a young boy on a pony rode up to the cabin. He shyly handed Maria a folded, sealed letter, and then rode off before she could say a word. The letter was from a Mrs. Gable, a widow who lived on a small homestead on the other side of the valley. Maria recognized the name. She was the quiet, sad-eyed woman Maria had seen at the chapel. The letter was short, the handwriting a bit shaky but clear. It read, "My dear, I saw you in the chapel that day. I saw your grief. I know the whispers of this town, how they can cut a woman to ribbons. My own husband, before he passed, was a hard man. There are more wounds in this valley than people know. You are not the only one they tried to shame. Keep standing. Sincerely, Eliza Gable." Maria read the letter 3 times, her eyes filling with tears. But these were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. The note was a small, fragile thing, But it was a lifeline. In a world that had condemned her, one person had offered a hand of understanding. It was a gift of immense value. Buoyed by this small act of kindness, Maria decided to fight back in her own way. She would not use her fists or angry words. She would use her needle and thread. She sent a message with a passing freight driver that she was available for sewing and mending work. At first, there was no response. But then a few of the poorer families, women who could not afford the dressmaker in town, began to send her work. She mended shirts, patched trousers, and even sewed a simple but beautiful christening gown for a new baby. Her work was impeccable, her prices fair. Slowly, cautiously, she began to build a fragile bridge of trust, one stitch at a time. The progress was slow, and the opposition was fierce. One afternoon, a young girl named Sarah, the daughter of a woman for whom Maria had sewn a dress, came to the cabin, bringing a small bouquet of wildflowers as a thank you. Maria was touched and invited the girl inside for a glass of milk. As they sat at the table, talking quietly, a group of women, led by Jebediah Stone's wife, Martha, marched up to the cabin. "Sarah!" Mrs. Stone called out, her voice sharp and righteous. "You come out of there this instant. Your mother would be horrified to know you were in the home of that woman." The girl fled the cabin in tears, and the women stood outside, their arms crossed, a silent, judgmental wall of condemnation. The message was clear. Maria was a contamination, a disease they were determined to keep from spreading. The final, brutal escalation came a week later. Luke found them in the early morning, lying near the creek. 2 of his best young calves were dead. There were no marks on them, no signs of a wolf or a mountain lion, but their bodies were bloated, and there was a strange, chemical smell in the air. Poison. Someone had deliberately poisoned his water source. It was a vindictive, cruel act, aimed at destroying his livelihood. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a stone in his gut, that Stone and his cronies were responsible. But there was no proof. Nothing he could take to Sheriff Brody. It was his word against theirs, and he knew whose word the town would believe. That night, for the first time since she had known him, Maria found Luke drunk. He was sitting at the table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, his movements clumsy and slow. He was staring at a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of 2 young men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a younger, carefree Luke. The other, she knew, must be William. As she watched, a single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. He did not seem to know she was there. He picked up the photograph, his calloused thumb stroking the image of his brother's face. "I failed him," he whispered, his voice thick with whiskey and a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. "I was not there. I let them take him." He looked up then, his eyes unfocused, but seeming to see her. "I will not fail you, Maria," he slurred, the words a broken, desperate promise. "I will not." She went to him and gently took the bottle from his hand. She knelt beside his chair and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You have not failed me," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "You have saved me." He stared at her, his drunken gaze slowly clearing as he focused on her face. He leaned into her touch, a great, shuddering sob shaking his entire body. He wept then, not silently as she did, but with a raw, racking agony, for his dead brother, for the poisoned calves, for the injustice of a world that was trying to grind them into dust. Maria did not speak. She simply held him, absorbing his pain, giving him the same silent strength he had so often given her. The rain started to fall outside, a soft, drumming sound that grew into a downpour. He eventually quieted, his breath evening out. He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. He stood, pulling her to her feet. Without a word, he led her outside, into the clean, cold, driving rain. They stood in the muddy yard, the water soaking their clothes, plastering their hair to their skin. He pulled her against him, and they made love there, in the barn, with the rain pouring down around them. It was not gentle or tender. It was a desperate, almost violent act of affirmation. It was a furious, passionate defiance of the poison, the hatred, and the death that surrounded them. It was a desperate, grasping attempt to feel something powerful, something clean, something alive in the midst of all the pain. They clung to each other as if they were the only two people left in a world that was being washed away. The night of the rainstorm had washed away some of the poison, but not the threat. In the days that followed, Luke moved with a new, grim purpose. The arrival of the man named Evans had changed everything. The fight was no longer with resentful neighbors. It was with a rich, powerful man from a world away. A man who could hire agents and bend the law to his will. Luke knew he could not simply wait for the next attack. He had to understand the enemy. He began to track the bounty trail, not with a gun, but with quiet, careful questions. He rode to Prescott, a larger town 2 days south, and spent what little money he had in saloons and telegraph offices, listening to the talk of freight drivers, lawmen, and travelers. He spoke of a hypothetical friend from the East, a man who had gotten himself into trouble with a prominent family in Virginia. He was a patient listener, and in the transient, gossip-fueled world of the frontier, information was a currency all its own. A telegraph operator, his palm greased with a silver dollar, remembered the inquiries Evans had sent. The messages were coded, but they mentioned a client in Denver, a disgruntled deputy in another town who had been passed over for a promotion. Spoke of a new judge in Denver, a man named Robert Standish, who was throwing his weight around, using his connections to put pressure on local law enforcement about a private family matter. The name hit Luke like a physical blow. Standish. The name Maria had screamed in her nightmares was Robert. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, sickening finality. Her abuser, her tormentor, was not just a wealthy man anymore. He was a federal judge, a man with the full power of the law behind him. He was a wolf who had draped himself in the robes of a shepherd. He returned to the cabin with a heavy heart, the knowledge a cold stone in his gut. He found Maria in the small garden she had started, her hands in the earth, a look of fragile peace on her face. He did not have the heart to tell her, to shatter that peace. But the enemy did not wait. The papers arrived a week later, delivered by a rider from the sheriff's office. They were cold, official, and terrifying. A thick sheaf of documents, stamped with the seal of the Denver District Court, addressed to a Miss Maria Delaney, currently residing under the protection of Mr. Luke Kerrigan. The language was dense and legalistic, but the meaning was brutally clear. They were a petition, filed by Judge Robert Standish, declaring Maria mentally unstable, a danger to herself and others. They cited her unwarranted flight from a private institution and her current cohabitation with a man of violent and unsavory reputation. The documents concluded with a summons ordering her to appear in Denver for a competency hearing. It was a trap, a death sentence masquerading as due process. To obey was to walk willingly back into the cage she had escaped. To ignore it was to become a fugitive from the law. Maria read the papers, her face draining of all color. She began to tremble, the documents shaking in her hand. "He found me," she whispered, her voice a thread of pure horror. "He will lock me away again. This time, I will never get out." She looked at Luke, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow the light in the room. This was her deepest fear, the monster that had haunted her sleep for years, now given form and legal authority. Luke took the papers from her trembling hands. "These are lies," he said, his voice a low, furious growl. "This is not law. This is a weapon." "But it has a seal," she cried. "It is official. No one will believe me. They will believe the judge." "Then we find someone who will," he said, his jaw set. He remembered hearing about an old lawyer, Thaddeus Kane, who lived in the next town over.
He had a reputation for being honest to a fault, a man who had retired from a lucrative practice because he was disgusted with the corruption he had seen. The next day, Luke rode to see him. Thaddeus Kane was a stooped, white-haired man with eyes that were still sharp and intelligent. He read the documents carefully in his dusty, book-lined office, his lips a thin, tight line. "This is a clever piece of villainy," Kane said, looking up at Luke over his spectacles. "It is all technically legal on the surface. The petition is filed correctly. The summons is issued by a legitimate court." He tapped a finger on the page. "But this medical testimony, it is vague, full of innuendo. And this sworn statement from the asylum director reads like it was written by the judge himself." "So it is a forgery?" Luke asked, leaning forward. "More like a fabrication," Kane corrected. "A house built of lies on a foundation of legal half-truths. I believe we could prove it. We could file a counter-petition, gather testimony about your character, challenge their medical evidence. But, son," he said, his expression grim, "it would take weeks, months, maybe. And in that time, Judge Standish could get a federal marshal to issue a warrant. They could come and take her long before we ever see the inside of a courtroom." The sliver of hope Luke had felt died. The law was too slow, too cumbersome. It was a tool for the patient and the powerful, and they were neither. He rode back to the cabin, the lawyer's words echoing in his mind. He was caught in a trap, with the jaws slowly closing in. He explained the situation to Maria. He tried to sound hopeful, but she saw the truth in his eyes. The fear that had been held at bay now consumed her completely. That night, as they lay in bed, the silence between them was a living thing, thick with unspoken terror. "Luke," she whispered into the darkness. "I am here," he answered. "Do you remember what you said? The day that man, Evans, came here? You said we could leave, that we could ride north and they would not find us." Her voice was small, desperate. "Could we still do that? Would you leave all this behind, for me?" Luke did not answer immediately. The question struck him to the core. Leave? He looked around the dark cabin, at the familiar shapes of the room he had built with his own hands. He thought of the land outside, the roll of the hills, the creek, the stand of pines. It was more than just property to him. It was the only thing he had left of his brother. William was buried here, on the hill overlooking the valley. This land was soaked in his brother's memory, in the injustice of his death, and in Luke's own guilt. To leave it would be to abandon the last piece of his own history, to let the men who had murdered his brother win completely. It felt like a betrayal. His hesitation was only a few seconds long, a flicker of indecision born of a deep and aching conflict. But in the charged silence of the room, it felt like an eternity. He felt her stiffen beside him. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice suddenly cold and distant. "I should not have asked. It was selfish." "Maria, no," he started, turning to her. "It is not that. It is just—" But she had already rolled away from him, her back a rigid wall between them. The conversation was over. He lay awake for hours, his heart a battlefield, torn between the woman he loved and the ghost he could not let go. He woke just before dawn to an empty bed. A cold dread seized him. He jumped up, his heart pounding. She was gone. Her few belongings were no longer by the bedside. The cabin felt hollow, silent, profoundly empty. On the table, he saw it, a single folded piece of paper from her ledger, the letter she had been writing to him. With trembling hands, he opened it. The script was neat, the words simple and clear, and they broke his heart. "Luke, I am writing this because I do not have the courage to say it to your face. I asked you to run away with me, and in your silence, I saw the truth. I am a burden to you, a danger. I came into your life like a storm, and I have brought you nothing but trouble. The men who haunt me will never stop, and if I stay, they will destroy you just as they destroyed me. I cannot let that happen.
You are the kindest, most decent man I have ever known. You showed me that love could be gentle. I will never forget that. I will carry your kindness with me until my last breath. Please, do not come after me. Just let me go. This is the only way to keep you safe."
"Maria."
A strangled cry of anguish escaped his lips. She had misunderstood his silence. She thought he was choosing his land over her. She was running again, not just from her past, but from him, to protect him. He ran to the door and threw it open. The world was white. A heavy snow had started to fall in the night, a thick, silent blanket that was already covering the ground. The storm would cover her tracks, but it would also slow her down. She was heading for the train station in Redemption. He knew it. It was the only way out. He did not waste a moment. He saddled Gideon, his movements swift and sure. He grabbed his rifle and his pistol belt. He did not bother with food or extra clothes. He had only one thought, one purpose: find her. He rode out into the swirling snowstorm, a lone, desperate man against the elements, his heart a cold, hard knot of fear. The ride was a nightmare. The wind howled, driving the snow into his face, blinding him. The trail was almost invisible, but he pushed on, driven by a primal fear he had never known before. He thought of her, alone in the storm, terrified. He thought of the men who were hunting her. He urged Gideon on, his own body numb with cold, his mind on fire. He reached the outskirts of Redemption as the gray light of late afternoon was beginning to fade. The town was hunkered down, the streets empty, the buildings dark shapes against the white snow. He saw the train station ahead, a plume of dark smoke rising from its chimney. And then he saw her. She was near the loading dock, trying to stay in the shelter of the overhang. Two men had her cornered. They were big, rough-looking men, their faces hard and mean. They were not from around here. Bounty hunters. Evans must have hired them. One of them had her by the arm, his grip cruel. She was struggling, her face a mask of pure terror. "You are coming with us, Missy," the man said, his voice a low growl. "The judge is paying good money for you." Something inside Luke snapped. All the rage, all the grief, all the fear of the past few days coalesced into a single, deadly point of focus. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He spurred Gideon forward, pulling his pistol from its holster in one smooth, practiced motion. The men heard the horse and turned, their eyes widening in surprise. Luke was on them in a matter of seconds. He did not aim to kill. He was not a murderer, but he was a man pushed beyond his limit. The pistol bucked in his hand, the report a flat, ugly crack in the snow-muffled silence. The man holding Maria cried out and staggered back, clutching his leg where a dark, wet stain was already spreading across his trousers. The other man fumbled for his own weapon, but he was too slow. Luke was out of the saddle, the barrel of his pistol now leveled directly between the man's eyes. "Leave," Luke said, his voice a deadly whisper. "Get your friend and ride out of this town. Do not ever come back." The man stared into Luke's eyes and saw his own death there. He nodded frantically, his face pale. He helped his wounded partner onto a horse, and the two of them fled into the storm. Maria had crumpled to the ground, her strength finally giving out. Luke holstered his pistol and went to her, kneeling in the snow. He gathered her into his arms. She was ice-cold and trembling uncontrollably. She collapsed against him, her face buried in his chest, her sobs muffled by his coat. He held her, rocking her gently, his own heart aching with a relief so profound it felt like pain. He took her to the sheriff's office. He kicked the door open and strode in, still carrying her. Sheriff Brody jumped to his feet, his hand on his gun. A few men who had been taking shelter from the storm stared, their mouths agape. "There has been a shooting at the train station, Samuel," Luke said, his voice ringing with authority. He gently set Maria down in a chair by the stove. "2 bounty hunters. They were trying to abduct her. One of them is wounded. They will not be back. He reached into his coat and pulled out the legal documents. He threw them onto the sheriff's desk. These are forgeries. Lies, sent by a corrupt judge in Denver to kidnap a woman he has abused for years. This town has turned its back on us. You have allowed your fear and your prejudice to make you blind. Now you have a choice. He turned to face the men in the room, his eyes blazing. All of you. You can continue to be cowards. You can hide behind your gossip and your self-righteousness and let a good woman be destroyed by a powerful man. Or you can stand for something. You can stand for justice. You can decide right now what kind of town redemption is going to be. A heavy silence fell over the room. The men shuffled their feet, their gazes dropping to the floor. Sheriff Brody looked from Luke's hard face to Maria, who was huddled by the stove, and then down at the papers on his desk. Then, the door opened. A figure stood there, covered in snow. It was the widow, Eliza Gable. She had heard the gunshot and had come to see what was happening. She looked at Maria, then at the hostile faces of the men. She walked slowly but deliberately to stand behind Maria's chair. "Mr. Kerrigan is right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This woman has suffered enough. I will stand with her." Another man pushed his way into the crowded room. It was Thaddeus Kane, the old lawyer. He had ridden in from the next town, having heard that federal marshals might be on their way. "And I will stand with her," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Those documents are a perversion of the law, and I will testify to that in any court." Then came the most surprising moment of all. Silas Croft, the rancher Luke had punched, stepped forward from the back of the room. He looked ashamed, his face red, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Kerrigan was right to hit me," he said gruffly. "My wife, she heard that sermon. We were wrong. This ain't right." He looked up, meeting Luke's eyes. "I will stand with him." One by one, other men in the room began to nod, to murmur their agreement. A tide of decency, long suppressed, began to turn. They were simple men, ranchers and storekeepers, but they knew right from wrong. They had been led astray by fear, but Luke's raw courage had shown them a better path. Sheriff Brody looked at the faces around him. He saw the shift, the change in the heart of his town. He picked up the documents from his desk. "There is no bounty for Miss Delaney in my jurisdiction," he declared, his voice firm. "These papers are meaningless here." He walked to the stove, opened the small iron door, and shoved the legal papers inside. They watched as the lies curled, blackened, and were consumed by the flames. The townsmen then followed Luke and Maria from the office. They walked as a group to the chapel on the hill, in a silent, solemn procession. They built a bonfire in front of the steps. The sheriff officially dropped the bounty, and the documents were burned in front of the entire community, the flames lighting up the snowy darkness, a beacon of justice in the heart of the storm. The winter that had nearly claimed Maria and broken Luke finally surrendered to a reluctant spring. The snow receded from the valleys first, lingering on the high peaks like a stubborn memory. The frozen earth softened, breathing a damp, loamy scent into the air. The creek, which had been an instrument of destruction, now ran clear and gentle, its banks lined with the bright, hopeful green of new shoots, wildflowers. A riot of purple, yellow, and blue began to pepper the hillsides, a fragile beauty returning to a scarred land. The change in the season was mirrored in the small cabin. A quiet, comfortable rhythm had settled between Luke and Maria. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their days governed by the simple, demanding tasks of frontier life. They were still isolated, their cabin a remote outpost on the edge of the valley. But the nature of that isolation had changed. It was no longer a fortress against a hostile world, but a sanctuary they had built together. The town's open hostility had curdled into a grudging, distant respect. Luke Kerrigan was no longer seen as a sinner, but as a man who would not be broken, a man who stood by his own. Maria had healed. The haunted, terrified look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent now, their sharp edges dulled by the safety of the waking world. She had found her voice, not just in speaking, but in laughter, a sound that had been absent for so long it felt like a miracle every time it graced the small cabin. Her transformation began to ripple outward, touching the town she had once fled in tears. It started with the sewing. The women who had once scorned her now sent their daughters to her, not just for mending, but for lessons. Twice a week, a small, shy group of girls would make the long walk up to the cabin. Maria would greet them on the porch, her smile warm and genuine. She taught them more than just how to thread a needle or sew a straight seam. She taught them to read, gathering them around the table with a well-worn copy of a book, her finger tracing the words as she sounded them out. She was patient and kind, her voice a gentle encouragement. She saw the same spark of intelligence and curiosity in these rough, uneducated girls that had once burned in her. For them. She was not the fallen woman of the preacher's sermon. She was the lady in the hills who knew how to make beautiful things and could unlock the mysteries of the printed page. Through these small, quiet lessons, Maria's warmth began to thaw the town's frozen judgment. She was no longer a scandal. She was becoming a necessity, a source of grace in a hard land. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to the cabin again. This time, he came not with a warning, but with an offer. He and Luke sat on the porch, drinking coffee, watching as Maria showed a young girl how to properly hem a skirt. "The town council met last week," Brody said, getting straight to the point. "Jebediah Stone is moving his family out, heading for California. Seems he found our brand of justice a little too direct for his liking." He took a sip of his coffee. "That leaves an opening. They have asked me to take on a full-time deputy. The pay is not much, but it is steady. The offer is yours. Luke, if you want it." It was a profound gesture, an offer of a badge, of a place at the very center of the community that had once cast him out. It was an apology and an invitation, a chance to become the lawman his brother would have wanted him to be. A few months ago, he might have considered it, but now, his world had changed. His priorities had been forged anew in the fire of the past winter. He looked over at Maria, who was smiling, her head bent close to the young girls as she praised her work. The sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair. In that simple, quiet moment, he saw his entire world. He turned back to the sheriff. "I appreciate the offer, Samuel," he said, his voice even and calm. "I truly do. But I will have to decline." He nodded toward the cabin, toward the woman who was the center of his life. "I have got enough to protect right here." Brody followed his gaze, and a slow, understanding smile spread across his face. He nodded. "I figured you might say that. I cannot say I blame you." That summer was a peaceful one, but it was tinged with sadness, a cholera outbreak, swift and merciless, swept through a neighboring valley. Redemption was spared the worst of it, but it claimed a few of its residents, including a young couple who worked a small farmstead. They left behind a son, a quiet, solemn boy of 7 named Timothy, with wide, frightened eyes. The town, in its newfound spirit of community, rallied around him. It was the widow, Eliza Gable, who took him in, her small home once again filled with the sounds of a child. Maria began to visit them often, bringing freshly baked bread or a jar of wild berry jam. She would spend hours with the boy, who rarely spoke. She did not push him. She would simply sit with him, sometimes in silence, sometimes reading to him from one of Luke's books. Luke would often watch from a distance as he worked, his heart constricting at the sight. He saw the profound, maternal gentleness in her, the way she could soothe the boy's silent grief with her quiet presence. He saw the way Timothy would slowly lean into her as she read, his small body finding comfort in hers. In those moments, Luke saw not just the woman he loved, but the family he had never thought he would have. He saw a future, as vast and hopeful as the valley spread out before them. As the leaves on the aspen trees turned to shimmering gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn, Luke knew it was time. One clear, cool evening, just as the sun was setting, he took Maria's hand. "Come with me," he said. "There is a place I want to show you." He led her up the steep hill behind the cabin, the one that offered the best view of the valley. It was a place he rarely went, a place that held the deepest pain of his past. At the crest of the hill, under the spreading branches of a lone, ancient pine tree, was a simple grave, a marker made of stacked river stones and a rough wooden cross, weathered gray by the sun and the snow. William Kerrigan, beloved brother. Maria had brought a small bunch of late-blooming wildflowers, their purple and gold heads a vibrant splash of color against the fading light. She knelt and gently placed them at the base of the stone marker. She ran her hand over the rough wood of the cross, her touch full of a reverence that went beyond words. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind whispering through the pine needles, the valley below them bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk. This was holy ground, the place where Luke's heart had been broken, and by bringing her here, he was finally letting her in, showing her the last, most heavily guarded piece of his soul. "He was a good man," Luke said at last, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He deserved better." Maria moved to stand beside him, her arm slipping around his waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "He would be so proud of you, Luke," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Proud of the man you are. Proud of how you stood for what was right, just like he did." Her words were a balm on a wound that had festered for years. He felt a great weight lift from his shoulders, a burden of guilt he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. He had not failed his brother. He had honored him. He turned to look at her, his heart overflowing with a love so immense it almost hurt. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her face. The last light of the sunset was reflected in her eyes, turning them to pools of liquid gold. She was beautiful, not just in her features, but in the strength and compassion that radiated from her. She had faced down the very worst of the world and had emerged not bitter, but gentle, her heart still capable of a profound and healing love. She looked up at him, her expression serious, her gaze deep and searching. In the quiet of that sacred place, with the ghost of his brother as their witness, she repeated the words she had once whispered in desperation by the firelight, the plea that had changed both their lives. "Make me forget every man before you." The words were the same, but their meaning had been transformed. It was no longer a plea for oblivion, but a testament to the new world he had built for her. It was an affirmation of his love, a recognition that he alone had the power to heal her. A slow, gentle smile touched Luke's lips. He reached up and tenderly brushed the strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her soft skin. He looked deep into her eyes, his own gaze filled with a love that was as solid and enduring as the mountains around them. "I do not want you to forget, Maria," he replied, his voice low and steady, each word a vow. "Forgetting is for ghosts. I want you to live." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of the clean mountain air and the promise of a lifetime. "I just want to be the one you remember most." The story ends as it began, with the snow. Months have passed, and the first storm of the new winter has arrived, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. But inside the small cabin, all is warmth and light. A fire roars in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the log walls. Luke sits in his chair, a book open on his lap, though he is not reading. Maria is curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even in sleep. He looks down at her, at the peaceful expression on her face, and a profound sense of contentment settles over him. The world outside is cold and unforgiving, but here, in this small space they have carved out for themselves, they are safe, they are home. The snow falls, silent and deep. But this time, their world is warm. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.